said, come up to us and we will show you something. We'll show you your head is what they meant. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel. Now that is faith, folks. That is faith. The victory's ours. Let's go. And so they started climbing up this, whatever it is, cliff or hillside. Verse 13, and Jonathan climbs on his hands and his feet. Here he is crawling up the thing on 4. And his armor bearer is coming up behind him. And they got to the top, and they fell before Jonathan and his armor bearer, and they slew all of them. And the first slaughter, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, was about 20 men. And you can imagine that little guy wondering what in the world was going on when all these guys were dropping at his feet. I don't know what he was using. And the earth started to quake, and everything started shaking and trembling. And before the whole thing was over, you can drop all the way down really to verse 22. All the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in Mount Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines fled, even they also followed hard after them in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day. Now listen, here's the point. God is not restrained by many or by few. Doesn't matter. Not only can God make them heroes because of their courage and their devotion, but because of their victory. Now let's go back to Matthew 10, and with that as a background, remind ourselves of the uniqueness of these 12 men. 12 men who literally turned the world upside down. Not only were they heroes because of their courage, because of their devotion, their obedience, but because they accomplished their goal. They literally established the church. And you and I are the product of their work. They touched a whole world. They extended the kingdom. Just these 12, one of them unfaithful. 11 faithful, humble, simple people just like us. And we're right back where we started, people. Listen. What kind of people does God use? He uses the common kind like we are. He uses the unqualified. God is in the business of accepting unqualified people because nobody's qualified. The Lord uses strong, bold leaders like Peter who take charge, initiate, plan, strategize, confront, command people, and who make big, big blunders. And he uses humble, gentle, inconspicuous souls like Andrew who seek no prominence but quietly bring people to Christ. And he uses zealous, passionate, uncompromising, task-oriented, insensitive, ambitious men like James, as well as sensitive, tender, loving, people-oriented, believing, intimate truth seekers like John. And he uses skeptical, analytical, mechanical, slow-witted, weak-faithed, visionless, pessimistic, insecure men like Philip. And he uses seekers of truth, honest, open, clear-minded, meditative, deeply surrendered men like Nathaniel, Bartholomew, who are full of faith and understanding, and yet who are flawed by serious sin such as prejudice. Now we're going to meet 2 others that he uses, Matthew and Thomas. Verse 3. The second group of 4 is Philip, Bartholomew or Nathaniel, Thomas and Matthew. Let's take Matthew first. Matthew is mentioned in every list, always in the same group, but nothing is ever said about Matthew and nothing is ever said by Matthew except one tiny little thing. And look in Matthew 9:9, and there's where you find it. Mark and Luke both allude to the same thing in just the same few words, and that is the extent of everything we know about Matthew. And as Jesus passed forth from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he saith unto him, follow me, and he arose and followed him. And when Matthew puts his name in the list in chapter 10, verse 3, he says, Matthew the tax collector. And may I hasten to add that no other disciple in the list is ever associated with his job. Why does Matthew say Matthew the tax collector? I mean, that's not something you're proud of. No, a tax collector was the most hated, despised, despicable human being in the society of Israel. And Matthew is showing us his genuine humility and sense of sinful unworthiness. Why does Matthew even comment about himself in verse 9? As Jesus passed forth from there, he saw a man named Matthew, and he said, "Follow me." What is the point of putting that there? The point is, in verses 1 to 8, Matthew is giving a demonstration that Jesus came to forgive sin. Verse 5, "Thy sins be forgiven thee." Verse 6, "The Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins." And Matthew slips himself in there in one verse to show that indeed Jesus can forgive sin. For he sees himself as the vilest sinner. That may be a reason why Matthew never speaks. He never asks a question. He never makes a comment. He never appears in an incident. He just is absolutely faceless and voiceless through the entire narrative of the Gospels. And it may be that his humility was born out of his overwhelming sense of sinfulness, that he was so overwrought by the sin of his life, that once forgiven, grace was so superabundant in his case that he felt himself unworthy to even speak a word. And so he is the silent man until the Spirit of God asks him to pick up his pen. And then he is given the privilege of writing the opening of the New Testament. 28 chapters on the majesty of the King of Kings himself. Matthew was a traitor. Matthew was an extortioner. Matthew was a robber and a thief. Matthew was greedy. Matthew was a social pariah or outcast. And he knew it. And look in Matthew 9:9, and there's where you find it. You see, to be a tax collector is to be a publican. And what that meant was that you as a Jew were used by the Roman government to collect taxes from the Jews to give to Rome. You then sort of worked for the oppressor. You were a traitor first class. And not only that, but you bought the right to collect taxes. So you paid the government. You bought into the system. And then the government would stipulate a certain amount of tax that had to be collected, and that was given to Rome. And then you were free to collect anything more you could from the people, and that you kept for yourself. And so there were bribes and extortionist routes taken, abuses beyond what we could even dream. There were two kinds. There were Gabai, G-A-B-B-A-I. They were the general tax collectors. They collected property tax, income tax, poll tax, standardized. There was not apparently as much graft at that level. Then there were the Mokas, M-O-K-H-E-S. They collected the duties. They collected duty on everything. They set up their little deal where the roads crossed, and they collected on all import, all export, all items bought, all items sold. They set tolls